the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Hello and welcome to the second part of this podcast dedicated to the great Indian cricketer of the Golden Age, KS Ranjitsinhji. My guest is Simon Wilde, cricket correspondent for the Sunday Times, whose biography, Ranji, the Strange Genius of Ranjitsinhji, is the basis of our discussion. Be sure to follow or subscribe to the Golden Age of Cricket podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. Now back to his actual batting and his style and his approach to batsmanship. One thing which is very apparent reading your book is, you go into details about his certainly his more successful innings, but what struck me was just how he tended to dominate the strike. And just by way of example, often you would say that he had a partnership of 150 with batsman X, but Ranji actually hit 130 of those runs. He seemed to have this ability, and I think I'm correct in saying that certainly for that age, he hit a lot of boundaries, and we've touched on it already. Maybe it was these new strokes that he brought in, like the leg glance, for example, which confused a lot of the fielding teams. And he just seemed to be someone who loved facing the cricket ball. And so he would hit boundaries to retain the strike, which was very smart. Do you think this was, just a clever tactic on his part, a very smart tactic, or was there something greater at play? Was he living up to his princely manner, perhaps, and having a sense of entitlement?
Yeah, possibly. I think the key was that because he had opened up the leg side of the field, he could basically score all around the wicket. I mean, this now in the modern era, we know all about players hitting we talk about 360-degree batsmen. They can hit it anywhere. But in those days, a lot of the field was not available to them in a way. They didn't think to score towards fine leg, off your hips in the same way. That wasn't done so much, I don't think. So once he developed an all-round game, he could find the gaps in the field. They couldn't. The opposing captains will suddenly find they hadn't got enough fielders for Ranji. They needed 15 men rather than 11. So he could find the gaps. He could hit the boundaries. he was if you're an all-round, if you can score all around the wicket, then it becomes very hard to set a field. So I think that probably explains his ability to hit so many boundaries, which was certainly the case. He was a prolific boundary hitter. I mean, not so much sixes in those days, though. You couldn't hit sixes unless you hit it right out of the ground. So we're talking about fours, right.
Or fives. Yes.
The beginnings had a lot of fours. So I'd say that was one of the explanations for that.
Let's talk about his only international test tour. I think he made a tour to the USA at one point, but his only test tour was that to Australia in 1897-98, where it's fair to say he had an uneasy relationship with the public and the press. I think it started off in a bit of a rocky way. I think the New South Wales government had to change their policy about letting a non-white person into the colony. But then there were some intriguing incidents that were played out in the press. Ernie Jones, who was the fast Australian and South Australian bowler, was called for throwing in England's match versus South Australia. And in one of his articles, Ranji tended to agree with the umpire, which didn't go down too well with the locals, as you'd expect. And that then was the Adelaide press, South Australian press, retaliated by claiming that Ranji didn't have the right to play for England as a non-white player. What do you make of all this, Simon? I mean, it's his first tour to Australia and he seems to be, rocking the apple cart. Was this indicative of who Ranji was?
I think it was, this is a tricky one. The Australian crowds then, and some would say still, like to express their opinion at a match, and I think this
That's
was
true.
quite different. That was quite different to how English crowds behaved. I mean, not saying that English crowds were perfect at all, but
Mm.
there's a definite. If you read the accounts of English cricketers going to Australia, the story is quite consistent about this. That they get English cricketers got quite upset at some of the heckling that they got and the sort of feedback from the crowd. Andrew Stoddart, the captain of the one tour that Ranji went on, he got very upset by some of his treatment from the locals and also the local press as well. The criticism could be quite harsh. And really, Australia was the only country that England toured where, in a way, things mattered. There were early tours of South Africa, but it was a far lower key sort of environment, and the local press, the local press was not aggressive at all, and the locals in South Africa weren't. I mean, these were in South Africa. South Africa was an even younger country than Australia, and a lot of the people that were there were English people who just emigrated to take advantage of the gold and the diamonds that were being found. So it was another piece of England really, whilst Australia had developed its own identity and was quite brash, if you like. And so the English cricketers in general found that quite hard to deal with, particularly if they started losing. And this is what happened on the tour that Ranji went on. England lost 4 of the 5 Test matches. So I think Ranji wasn't the only one in that team who found it a bit rough
Yes.
going. But the difference with Ranji was that he had agreed to write a series of pieces for an Australian magazine, a sort of weekly periodical, I think. And so he was expressing his own opinions about what was going on a regular basis. And this stuff got read and it got quoted in the Australian papers. So he was not the first cricketer to find out that if you start writing stuff and complaining, then people notice and you'll get a bit of fight back.
Yeah.
And yes, as you say, he supported the verdict on Ernie Jones's bowling. Was it legitimate or not? He didn't seem to think so. That didn't go down well. He was probably a bit naive in what he was doing. He didn't know any better. He was still quite young. He was 25, hadn't been to Australia before. There's lots of things that other players have gone through as well. Happened to him. But I think it was of a piece really of the English cricketers complaining about quite a lot. He complained about the flies in Adelaide and the heat and the travel. But I think there was, on a more profound note, he probably did experience a bit of racism as well. He complained. In fact, one of the other England players, Jack Hearn, kept a diary and he talked about Ranji in his diary, saying that Ranji was upset by Australians in general. He didn't like them. I suspect he had a bit of trouble on that front, but we don't really have the concrete evidence on that. But it's just a sort of a guess, really. But I wouldn't be surprised.
But we have to say, at the same time, he, in a disastrous tour for the English, he did find some on-field success in that tour. I mean, he hit a blistering 175, I think, in the Sydney Test, which was only his 3rd Test overall, I think. As you say, it was an overall disastrous Test for England. And he also, we should give him credit that he actually made a tour to Australia, because some of the other amateurs of that time, C.B. Fry, his very good friend, and Stanley Jackson, never made it to Australia. So credit to Ranji for actually coming to Australia at least once as an amateur.
Yeah, and as you say, he did do well, and he was people liked his batting. I mean, it wasn't a case that the Australians as a whole didn't like him. I think they did. They liked his cricket and they liked his style of play, and he was a very glamorous figure to them, as he was to people in England as well. So he was a sort of attractive figure as well. But some of the things he said caused some upset. But interesting, he never went back, and I think there was subsequent Australian tours he could have gone on, and he didn't. And I think there was a feeling that he didn't want to go back after what had happened on that particular trip. That it wasn't that happy a time for him.
Fair enough. Now, something that is permeating all through his cricket career at this stage, and continues to for a number of years, not known to the general public, but one that we now know through studying the history is that he had just all sorts of problems with his finances. He was constantly asking for his allowance from India to be increased, and he was constantly being chased by creditors. Um, did he spend money because he thought he had to maintain this appearance of wealth, or do you think he was just plain? Do you think he was just plain reckless?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's an intriguing one. I suspect that he wanted to behave like a prince. He had to keep up this this act, if you like, that he was a he was a significant figure back in India. Nobody in England, knew otherwise. Some of the British civil servants would have known, and the people in government, particularly those who got to hear about him not paying his debts, would have known a bit more about what the true Ranji was like. But they would have probably also known what he was up to. I mean, it wasn't unknown for people not to pay their bills. He wasn't the only one behaving like that. But I think it was his way of trying to act out a life of a prince, and that was the way he could, in a way, convince ultimately the people who mattered, which was the British government people, that he did have a case. And of course, I mean, you could spend a long time talking about how come the young man who did become the new ruler the young boy that was born and basically leapfrogged Ranji in the succession list. He took over in the early 1900s after his father died, the man who nearly chosen Ranji. And then a couple of years later, he dies in mysterious circumstances. And a friend of Ranji who wrote a book, E.H.D. Sewell, who played for Essex, he was an amateur. He writes an interesting chapter about the rumours of foul play and that this young man was poisoned. So it's you couldn't make it up really. So it was a very convenient time that he died. This chap, because Ranji really was hitting financial difficulties in the couple of years before that, and in fact Ranji had stopped playing cricket in England before he died. Because he'd gone back to India supposedly to further his claim. Well, hey presto, it happened, and then the British duly chose Ranji in his place because there was no obvious line of succession anymore. So the British had to get involved and help choose someone, and they chose Ranji. They would have chosen Ranji partly because, in their eyes, he'd been trained up for the job. They knew what he was like. He was a sort of effectively an Anglo-Indian, really, in outlook. He was well educated, and they knew, or they thought, that he would play by their rules. He would be obliging. They could deal with it. He was someone they could do business with, if you like. But of course, as it happens, he was somebody that nobody could do business with because he kept reneging on his bills. But they thought he was the best man available, and so they helped facilitate his succession. And that happened in 1907. When Ranji was sort of in his mid-30s. And after that, he ruled for about 25 years.
Yeah, and just taking a step back, I mean, it wasn't like he was at the peak of his form when he just suddenly decided to challenge for the throne. He did actually experience quite a severe drop in form. I mean, he plays what turns out to be his last Test match in 1902 against the visiting Australians, but at county level, first class level, he has really bad run of form, and then he doesn't play any first class cricket from 1905 to 1907, and this is when he's staking his claim. Do you think this loss of form leading up to his ascension to the throne, do you think the form was directly related to the financial issues he was having and his plans to challenge for the throne?
Yeah, I mean, the particularly striking, intriguing year was 1902, which was a famous year. The Australians came over. Australia won the Ashes. Victor Trumper was at his height of his fame. It was a very wet summer. Pitches were difficult for scoring runs. So no batsman apart from Trumper actually really had a good summer. Ranji didn't have a good summer. He struggled, and in the Test matches he played, he struggled really badly. I mean, he was in no sort of form at all. You could blame it partly on the pitches, but I think there were issues going on with his finances. In fact, we know it because there's some sort of documentary evidence of some cases that were going on at that time, and things really were getting a bit tricky for him financially and in terms of the legal cases against him. And he drops. So what's interesting is that he drops out of cricket for about a month after he's been dropped by England after the fourth test, which England lose by 3 runs. It's a famous match, which is called Fred Tate's match because Fred Tate dropped a catch at the end.
Yes.
That was towards the end of the game that was crucial to the outcome. And then Fred Tate was last man out. He was bowled with England needing 3 to win. Something like that. So it was known as Fred Tate's match, but really it should be known as Ranji's match because Ranji did absolutely nothing in that game. And had he scored even 20, if he scored 25 in one innings, England would have won. But he was a sort of shadow of himself, really. And England dropped him for the final test, which equally famous game where Gilbert Jessop got a very fast 100 and England won by 1 wicket. Very exciting match. Ranji missed that game, never played for England again, and just sort of disappeared really for several weeks. And that seemed to be at a time when he really was in difficulties. He played in 1903 and 1904 for Sussex, on and off, sort of running hot and cold really with his run scoring. And I think by that point he'd almost got to the point where he realised that he had to do something about his situation. Really, he couldn't carry on like this. He was, he didn't have any cash, and so he went back to India. And as I already said, the man who was on the throne died in mysterious circumstances, and that opened the door to Ranji taking over. So I think that in a way cricket had served its purpose for him. It had given him fame, it had given him a significant status. And it was time, probably in his eyes, to move on to other things. He can't keep playing forever. So I think there was his focus on cricket was waning, and his form was waning.
Yeah, but as you allude to there, he would just come and go. Like I think he returned for some matches in 1908 and then again in 1912, and then perhaps most remarkably, as a 47-year-old in 1920, he returns to play just 3 first-class matches for Sussex. And this is after he's lost his right eye in a hunting accident. As you say, he was always off hunting. And at this stage, he's lost all his form. He plays 3 matches and scores a total of 39 runs at an average of just 9. What were the factors behind him coming back in 1920? Was there something else at play here?
I think it was. I don't think particularly. I think it was just it was almost a sort of a vanity thing. Could he still do it? He wanted to know. 47, highly unlikely. He's only got one eye. I mean, why did he allow himself to be persuaded that it might be a good idea? It seems sort of, rather pathetic, really, that he should try, and unsurprising that he failed, really. But it was 1920, and there'd been a lot of cricket had started in England after the war in 1919. So this was only the second summer post-war, and there were a lot of people who were playing cricket in those early seasons after the war was over that were sort of injured, mentally. God knows what some of them were like. But people returned to cricket. In a way, he wasn't the only sort of damaged person who was coming back to. He wasn't injured in the war, as you say, he was injured in a shooting accident. But he wasn't the only one who was trying to return to a normal life after the horrors of the war. And so it wasn't maybe quite as unusual as it sounded. Bizarrely, there was a guy who played for Northamptonshire who had one leg. He had a wooden leg and he played cricket.
Yeah.
Again, didn't work. Oh. This is sort of what happened, and I don't think there was anything in it other than he thought he'd give it a go, and it didn't work out. But it's a rather sort of sad way for his career to end. Really, it would have been better if he had. There isn't much record of him playing it, sort of even recreational cricket after the First World War. It really was a one-off.
Yeah, we could probably also suggest that it was done out of helping to boost morale for the English public after the First World War. I mean, I think C.B. Fry played for a few seasons as well, even though his best was probably behind him. I think a few of the so-called golden age players in Australia did the same. Clem Hill played some first-class matches in the 1920s as well. And he was certainly, of an age where it probably wasn't expected of him. So that was perhaps another factor. Simon, I just want to, we have touched on it already, but I just want to touch again on racism with Ranjitsinhji, because he was playing cricket in Victorian England, and it seems like they had a very interesting relationship with him and the colour of his skin. I've just got this quote from a former English cricketer, R.H. Littleton, who in 1899 wrote, and I quote, "The English public is a curious one, and one of its peculiarities is its readiness to deify a cricketer, all the more because he is not an Englishman and is of a different colour. They would have admired Ranjitsinhji as a white batsman, but they worshipped him because he is black." Was Ranji subject to racism as we know it today?
Yeah, well, that's the big question, really, isn't it? We only have anecdotal evidence, really, a very small amounts of evidence that this was the case. I mean, well, some areas of English cricket were reluctant that he should ever play for the English national team. I mean, he wasn't born in England, obviously. He became an English cricketer because he played the English county system, and this made him eligible. I mean, there were no strict rules in terms of who is eligible for a test team. In fact, those rules were introduced about 10 years later, and it was agreed that you had to have either been born in a particular country or you'd lived there for, I think, 4 years, something like that. And Ranji would have qualified under that sort of second basis in living in England for more than 4 years. So, but at the time, he was he presented a challenge to the English authorities, which they'd not really faced before. And in 1896, when he played his first test matches, the system that applied was that the host ground, the ground that hosted the test match, their committee would pick the team. So England didn't have a selection panel in 1896. So when the match was at Old Trafford in Lancashire, the Lancashire committee decided whether he or anyone else would be in the team. When he was at Lords, the MCC committee decided, and so on. Surrey, if it was at the Oval, Surrey would decide. And in fact, the MCC committee decided that he wouldn't play the first test of that summer, but the Lancashire committee decided that he would play the second test of the summer, and that's when he got his 100 that we've talked about. So, was the MCC committee being racist in terms of leaving him out? Did they frown upon him because he was not white? We don't really know. There's probably suspicion that that was an element of the decision. And there are some stories of when Ranji got his 100 for England at Old Trafford that summer, that there were people at Lords who criticised him even being allowed. They still weren't happy, even though he'd scored 100 for England. They were not happy that he played, and it was because of his colour. There is evidence. There is some circumstantial evidence to support that idea, and I'm sure it would be the case. It's hard to imagine it wouldn't be, but I should think that it's often about class as much as anything. Some classes would accept him better than others. Some people of a certain background would accept him better than others. I think he did. I think he did experience racism, and he dealt with it pretty well, really. He navigated his way through the British social system, didn't he? Pretty well, and ended up somewhere near the top. By the time Edward VII was on the throne, Ranji was going shooting with him. So he didn't stop him mixing with the top brass in the country. That's for sure.
No, he seems like a very resilient character, actually, and considering what he achieved in that time, is quite extraordinary, really. Well, let's turn to a happier subject, Simon. Let's look at his statistics, and I'm just going to read through some numbers. Feel free to jump in at any point. But we've spoken already about when he made his debut and his final first-class match and Test match. But the numbers are really interesting. I'll just we only ever talk of Ranjitsinhji, the batsman, but I'll quickly go over his bowling because it's not insignificant. At a first-class level, he took 133 wickets for 4,601 runs. It was an average of 34.59, but his best bowling was 6 for 53, which is not bad. But at a Test level, he only took one Test wicket. So his figures are 1 for 23 at an average of 39. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Simon, but do you know, this is a pub trivia sort of question. Do you know who Ranji's only Test victim was?
I don't. I'm hoping you'll tell me.
Well, I had no idea, and it is one of those very random questions, but anyone listening will then be able to tell their friends. It was JJ Kelly, the Australian wicketkeeper, and I think he had him caught behind, I think. I'm sure someone listening will be able to correct me, but there you go. If anyone wants to use that as a conversation starter. But turning our attention to his batting, which of course is what he's remembered for. So he played 15 Test matches, which actually seems quite few even for that time, considering how famous he was. He batted 26 times, 4 not outs, didn't quite make 1,000 runs. He hit 989. His highest score was 175, which we spoke of, was that famous innings at Sydney in his only tour to Australia. And he finished with 2 centuries and 6 half centuries with an average of 44.95. Not surprisingly, his first-class statistics are even more impressive. So 307 matches, 500 exactly times he went to the wicket. He scored 24,692 runs, highest score of 285 not out, and he had a batting average of 56.37, having scored 72 centuries. A couple of things to note here, Simon, is that average, first-class average of 56.37, as you note in your book, was actually the best completed career batting average of any English batsman until Geoffrey Boycott broke it in 1986. So he had he had his name at the top of the list for a very long time. What else have I noted here? Yes, keeping in what I was talking about earlier about how fast he scored his runs. He scored in first-class cricket 11 pre-lunch session centuries, I suppose, meaning he took his score from whatever it was, say 44, to past 144 before lunch, which is just extraordinary. And he did it on 11 occasions. And finally, and this statistic was one I noted last year, Ranji's name appeared in the news when Harry Brook, the young English batsman, beat his 125-year record of having scored the most runs in the first 6 innings of a Test career. So we've already noted how Ranji really took to Test cricket immediately with his century on debut and then 175 in Sydney. He scored 418 runs in his first 6 innings, and Harry Brook beat him with 436. So there you go. Ranji is still making headlines a century later. Simon, I just want to finish the podcast talking about Ranji's legacy. He's known today as sort of the father of Indian cricket, I suppose. And the Indian Red Ball domestic competition is named after him. Is he still revered today in cricket circles, both in India and abroad?
Yes, he is. I think the Ranji Trophy is. I mean, it's great that his name lives on in the Indian domestic competition. Almost 100 years since he died. That's it's quite a thing, really. I mean, his status in India is slightly ambiguous because as one of the princely rulers, he was against Indian independence. The princely rulers as a group wanted to carry on with the system that they'd got, where the British ran a large part of India and the rest was run by them. Understandably, independence stripped them of power, really, and they were given sort of financial guarantees about their future. Their palaces were not all taken away from them, but politically they lost all their power in 1947. Ranji had died by then, but he knew the wind was blowing towards independence by the 1920s, and then obviously Gandhi's movement made it a very live issue. Ranji was against all that, so in a way, modern, independent, vibrant India does not look back on the princes particularly kindly. So there's a slightly ambiguous status to him, but he's revered as a cricketer, and as we say, they still call their domestic tournament after him. So that's a pretty big thing, really. So
yeah,
his name does live on, and considering how long ago he played, that's a significant thing.
Yes, absolutely. And finally, Simon, what do you think Ranji would have thought of modern cricket? My feeling is he would have assimilated to T20 cricket quite easily with his rapid scoring and his habit of inventing stroke play. But was he also an upholder of the traditions of the game?
Yes, he was. I mean, I don't think he was particularly. I mean, he died shortly after Bodyline, literally within weeks of the end of that tour. But he was not. I don't think he was particularly in favour. But I mean, he was. He was viewing it from a long distance. He hadn't watched it in person, so yes, I think so. But he was a traditionalist. But having said that, as we've discussed, he invented new cricket strokes, and he would have, if he was here now watching a T20 game, his response would be, "I told you could score around the wicket, and that's now what all the best players do. They're doing exactly what I did. I told you that was the way to go. I was playing T20 cricket before you lot thought of it." So I think that would sort of be his attitude, and that's sort of his legacy, really, that he was the first guy to come up with this sort of stuff, and that in a way is his greatest legacy. Never mind all the stats and the rest of it. It's the way he looked at a cricket field and decided where he could score. He was the first one to see the potential.
That's a good point. And I also think he would have enjoyed the money associated with modern cricket. He would have, it would have stopped a lot of heartache for him, that's for sure.
He would have paid a lot of bills, wouldn't it?
It would have, yes. Well, Simon, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I hope my listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have. Revisiting, hearing you revisit Ranjitsinhji after all these years. I appreciate you delving into the memory bank. It's been most enjoyable, so thank you.
Thank you.
That's all from me. Please remember to follow or subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform. My name is Tom Ford, and until next time, it's bye for now.